will forever be a legend here at Tottenham. It's a massive club. Everything I do is for the long term.
And still Ricky Villa. What a fantastic run. He scored.
Gascoigne going to have a crack. He is, you know. Oh, he's there.
Here's Lucas Moura. Oh, they've done it. The wait for silverware is over.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Tottenham Way. A very dispiriting evening for Tottenham, a very chastening performance at the Emirates. They've been beaten 4-1 in the North London derby with Eberici Eze. Of course, it had to be him after Spurs tried to sign him in the summer and Arsenal pinched him, scoring a hat-trick in the game. A really difficult night for Thomas Frank. I'm Tom Barclay from The Sun. I'm joined by Tom Allnutt of The Times and George Sessions from the Press Association. Guys, I suppose, Tom, let's start off with your thoughts from tonight's performance and what this performance meant for Thomas Frank, because I think a lot of fans right now are getting increasingly frustrated by some of the performances and the lack of ambition shown in some of these performances. And it feels like he was going along okay, and then he's had two very difficult London derby defeats to two of Tottenham's biggest rivals in Chelsea, which was 1-0, but let's be honest, it should have been more. And then tonight against, the old enemy, Arsenal, in a 4-1 defeat. What are your thoughts, Tom?
Yeah, it was a miserable day for Tottenham fans, to be honest. A really poor performance, getting thrashed away at Arsenal and barely laying a glove on them, really, And it was a really bad day for the team, I think, and disappointing because I think, despite the sort of form this season at home, I think the positives of the kind of glass half full view of the Frank season so far is that they have been good away from home. And that in these kind of games where Frank sets them up with a plan and a strategy, I think we wondered if maybe they wouldn't win the game or even draw, but they would probably put on a decent performance and be compact and cause Arsenal some problems. In truth, the first half an hour was a bit of a stodge fest. It was really stop-start kind of game. And then once Arsenal got the first goal, from there they just, it never looked like being a match Spurs were gonna really threaten them at all. And I think instantly it felt in the ground, like it was going to be a damage limitation game. I don't know whether that's just kind of Spurs sort of, pessimism on my part, but you almost were immediately fearing a kind of a 3-4-5-0, and I think particularly when they conceded that second goal just before half time, maybe we'll get into it in a bit more detail, but I just think that's been a habit of this team for a while, to be honest. It's not just something that's been happening under Frank, but conceding goals in clusters. I think when they concede that goal in the 39th minute, I think they just have to get into half time there at 1-0 and reset. To concede another one so quickly and then clearly to concede another goal so early in the second half before, to be honest, there were still Arsenal fans filing back in when that hit the net. I thought, obviously the game was over at that point. So a really difficult afternoon for Spurs fans, not just because of the result. I think a lot of Tottenham fans are realistic and sensible enough to know that you can go to the Emirates right now and lose this match, and we know that they haven't won there since, isn't it 2010 in the league, So I think people weren't expecting miracles, but they were expecting a performance, something to get behind. And there was very, very little to get behind there today, wasn't there?
Well, that's the key, isn't it, George? Isn't it? It's the performance. That's the worrying thing. I think Tom's hit the nail on the head. I don't think many Spurs fans, particularly with the way Arsenal are playing at the moment, will have expected much. And the fact that the Spurs never really get much from the Emirates anyway. But it's very similar to that Chelsea game where there were a few sort of grumbles going into the game about some of the home performances. Obviously, Bournemouth, definitely Wolves, even though they didn't actually lose that game. But the Chelsea game was so poor that it sort of escalated the sort of concerns that some fans have over Thomas Frank and his style. As a fan, how much did tonight's performance add to that? Was it on a similar level, or is there an understanding for you that this is Arsenal away? What do you think?
Yeah. It's tough, isn't it? I think what kind of makes this worse in a sense is that part of why people wanted Thomas Frank is for these games. You felt like, I look at what he did last season with Brentford. They went to Arsenal and got a draw. I believe Brentford won at Stamford Bridge last season, and Thomas Frank's got an excellent record, I think, against Chelsea generally. He come in, and kind of a big part of his remit is in these games, Spurs are going to be a lot more competitive. And at the start of the season, they were, very good forms against PSG, brilliant win at Man City. But these two games, I think the XG today was 0.07, and that's including a wonderful goal from Richarlison. And obviously against Chelsea is 0.05. It's just not good enough in these games. And look, Arsenal are brilliant. They're such a good team. They've got so many players out injured, and they're still streaks ahead of Tottenham. But I think there was kind of an opportunity there today. Gabriel's such a big player for them, and Odegaard's not playing, Havertz is not playing, and there's three key players there. Gyökeres, as much as the goals aren't really flowing for him, it sounds like he's really contributing in lots of other ways. Those four players are missing, and look, I'm sure at some point we'll talk about the players that Tottenham are missing, but they've been missing them all season, Solanke, Maddison, Kulusevski. So, why were Spurs very good in August when they were playing PSG and Man City, and now in November when they're playing Chelsea and Arsenal, they look a shadow of that team. And that's where the concerns come in. Sort of 3-4 months down the line, you expect to see some sort of progress with Thomas Frank's team. And I think there's been very, very tiny baby steps. I thought Manchester United was a bit of a better performance. Obviously, Copenhagen was good, but bookended by these two derby defeats and in such a bad manner, worse than what we've seen in recent years, under loads of different managers, Conte and Mourinho. It is a concern for Frank. It's really early days, but I think he's losing people with these performances, and he's got to find a way quickly to get people back inside and jump on the ride.
Yeah, you mentioned years gone by, and when Thomas Frank was in the press conference afterwards, and he was talking sort of through the plan of being aggressive and sort of pushing them up and with their press, and it not coming off, and then end up being pushed back and being quite passive. I couldn't help but think of Ange last time they were at the Emirates where they lost 2-1. And I actually didn't think Spurs were that bad that day, but Andrew was sort of raging after that game and talked about how passive his team were and how he didn't want them to look like that. Let's talk, I suppose, Tom, let's talk a bit about the setup. Because personally, going into this game, I think we're all thinking that actually back three would not be a bad strategy. I'm not sure I would have benched Simons based on how he'd been playing better of late, albeit I was thinking, because I've been quite critical of Xavi Simons, and I've been saying, in the last couple of games he's played better. Well, the bar was pretty low. Like there's been nothing close to what Eze produced today from Xavi Simons, so it's not like a shock he didn't play. But it was still a choice from Frank not to go for him and to go with the back three. I just feel like, and to be honest, Frank himself said this, that you can set up wherever way you want. That doesn't necessarily mean that. Just because you're playing with the back three, you can't be way more imposing on a game than obviously Tottenham were today. But to sort of unpack that, how much, Tom, do you feel that them starting in that formation was part of their issue? Because I think one of the questions of Frank in the press conference was, did that almost set the tone, almost the mindset for the players that we're going to defend more than we normally do in this game? And did that contribute in any way to the sort of lackluster performance? Just on mute, Tom.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I think it is worth just saying before we get into this, that Arsenal did this to Man City, a few weeks ago, and Pep Guardiola was kind of asked after the game, why are you playing like this? This isn't what we've come to expect from City. And he sort of basically said, well, Arsenal put that upon us, that we didn't want to play like that. They put it upon us. So I think it is just worth, I don't know, reminding people, but just that going away to the Emirates is obviously a very difficult task, and you can have a plan, but it's difficult to execute that plan. Do I think that Frank wanted to sort of sit deep and have 20% of the ball in the first half an hour? I think probably not. I think his idea was to press high and to try and win the ball high, and he talked a lot in that press conference about duels, and he talked a lot about not being close enough. Basically, he wanted to get into a fight with Arsenal, but basically they weren't close enough to do it. And I think, you can look at that two ways. Either that Spurs' pressing wasn't cohesive enough, but also maybe that Arsenal found ways out. I thought they were clever. They pushed Timber up high. They pinned Odegaard back. I mean, at a time, the Spurs were playing almost a back six, because Odegaard had to follow Timber back into kind of left back. So Arsenal are a good team, and that's not going to surprise anyone. But that has to be part of this debate as well. Spurs aren't the only team who have struggled against Arsenal in this way. That said, I do think I sort of disagree with you. I think playing the five at the back, I just wonder what kind of message that sends, to the players and to the fans, because ultimately it's not just five. They're playing Palhinha, who is a defensive midfielder, and as we've discussed before, a very defensive midfielder, and clearly Vicario. So you've got 7 defenders on the pitch essentially, and when you go to the Emirates, I completely accept. I think that Frank probably looked at it and thought, the best way to play against Arsenal is to be compact, to sit deep. We've seen Arsenal struggle against teams who do that. I think the percentages suggest that is probably the best way to play. And I mean, I watched I don't know if you saw the interview that Frank did over the international break with Sky about kind of, a sort of tactical masterclass. And I found it really interesting. One of the things that he talked about was how he hates, players taking shots, right? I think we talked about this before. He hates players taking shots from distance. He likes them to work it wide because the number of goals you actually score from outside the box is very low compared to the number of goals you score in the 6-yard box. So keep passing until you get the ball into the 6-yard box, much higher percentage of scoring. But the problem is with that, I think, is that when you take a long shot, you can hit the post. You can whistle one just wide of the post. You can draw a good save and get a corner. You can get deflection that actually goes in. All these things create a little bit of chaos. They generate momentum. They can stir the fans up. Football is about percentages to an extent, I think, and I don't really buy this idea that Frank is a negative coach. I don't think he is. I think you look at his career and what he did at Brentford. I think he is not a negative coach. He likes to play aggressive front foot football. But what I do think he is I think he's a percentages man. He's a logic man. He looks at plans and percentages and numbers. And I think in a game like this, you have to accept that a derby game needs a bit of chaos. And to be honest, Tottenham, Spurs, the identity of the club, we've talked about it before. They need a bit of adrenaline. You can't just go into this kind of game and say, well, look, we've got a 60% chance of winning the match if we play a back five and we don't let Arsenal, have too much space. There has to be more than that because there has to be some emotion there. You have to bring the fans into the game. You have to carry the players with you. So, I accept that 5 at the back might have been the sensible, smart solution to kind of limiting Arsenal. We don't know. If Spurs had played 4-3-3, they might have also got hammered 4-1. I just don't think Frank is learning at the moment that these matches, they require a little bit of something else. The vibes are also important in football, and at the moment, I agree with George. The way they're playing, he's losing the fans. And also, to be honest, I think there's a risk that he's going to start losing the players as well in these big games.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tom. I was sort of thinking myself, half of management is just making players feel 10 feet tall, isn't it? And, Jurgen Klopp was a genius at that. He made average Liverpool players play out of their skin because they felt like world beaters. And I've said it a lot of times. I think Tottenham have got a good team. Their starting team isn't as good as Arsenal's clearly. But, you can probably go through and there's probably, 4 maybe players that would get an Arsenal team, I think. Maybe 5, but 4 out of 7 is not terrible.
George, well, that was one of the things I was going to ask you later, really. So I'm not even sure how many Spurs players get into the Arsenal squad, let alone the team. I know it's easy to say that after they've been battered 4-1, but genuinely, I was looking through it. I mean, I think Vicario probably takes Kepa's place, but I'd have Raya over him every day of the week. Probably Van de Ven and Romero get in the squad, but I'd probably pick Saliba and Gabriel. Fullbacks, maybe you could make a case for some of the Spurs players, but really you could definitely argue that what Arsenal have got, they might stick with. Not sure any of the Spurs midfield get into the Arsenal midfield. Maybe Kulusevski, but I mean, again, it's a push. And actually, ironically, I think Solanke might get in, not only into the squad, but the team when he's fit. Because I'm not sure Gyökeres.
I was going to say Solanke.
So that underlines what a miss he's been. But that is interesting. I mean, it's something I wanted to come on to later, but seeing as you've brought it up, is it does underline, for me at least, the absolute massive chasm in quality between the two squads. And it's not surprising because Arsenal have spent 50 million on Ben White, who's now their backup right back. I mean, they've spent the money, so they should be at that level, and they've paid the wages that go with it. But But yeah, I just thought it's interesting, seeing as you mentioned that. I think Tottenham's team isn't terrible by any stretch, but I think it just shows you the massive difference for me between the two sides.
There is definitely a gulf, but I think Tom's right when he says when you set up in this three at the back, five at the back, whatever you want to call it, you do send the message that we are not as good as this team. And yeah, obviously, you are right in a lot of that senses. I think you could make a case for Romero, Van der Ven, Kulusevski, and Solanke. They'd probably be my four that I would push. Obviously, I take Gabriel and Saliba are very good defenders, really good defenders. But you are just telling the team that we are not as good as this team we're going on the field. And rightly or wrongly, already you're chipping away at the morale. Tottenham, Thomas Frank said on Friday, we will not accept a 0-0. And look, I understand why he went with a back five. And I think, to be honest, it did work for 35 minutes in the sense that Declan Rice has the early shot and then Saka has 2 free kicks. But Arsenal didn't create anything until that goal. And that goal was a real lapse in concentration. Destiny Udogie has been good lately. Wanders off, plays Trossard on side. He doesn't hold the line. And it's a tiny bit unlucky because Mickey Van der Ven slides in and it deflects in. But until that goal, the back five had worked. But having said that, you're still kind of telling the team that we're not good enough to go to Arsenal and go toe to toe with them. And I don't think that's a good message to send to these players. And look, we know how frustrated did Romero get under Antonio Conte playing a certain style of football. So we know certain people in this squad don't want to play this way. And where Tom's talking about kind of, potentially losing fans playing this way, he can't lose the players playing like this way. But I think they would have felt today that maybe in hindsight, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, that was the wrong game plan. Because unless this works, unless plan A works perfectly and every player is on it, as soon as it goes wrong and the goal goes in, it's hard to come back from that. And that was the big issue.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about some of the comments he had in the pre-match press conference. And I don't know, you feel like Captain Hindsight here, sort of picking it apart, but he did sort of bring that up of his own volition. We will not play for a 0-0. But I have to say, watching that today, that felt like exactly what they were doing. They looked like they're trying to defend their way to a draw. It felt like the only way they were going to get a result. That's how it seemed to me. And the other thing that he mentioned, which comes off the back of what Tom was saying about the chaos. Well, he was the one who said it's going to be a madhouse, but you've got to embrace. You've got to embrace the chaos. You've got the controlled chaos. He put it that way, and I sort of agree with you, Tom, on that one. I don't feel like there was much of that really at all, and that did probably contribute to a certain extent to the performance. And again, George, you were saying about how when Thomas Frank came in, a lot of the time it was for the hope was that for games like this, what he could do to Tottenham's chances, because whilst a lot of people sort of criticise him for being maybe, from the Brentford, a sort of middle ranking team and making the step up and whether he can do it or not. Well, this kind of game should have been, whether you think that's the case or not, this definitely should have been something, a sort of scenario that he's very familiar with, being the underdog effectively and getting those players up for it to put everything on the line. So that was why I was so worried, I suppose, by Vicario speaking after the game, saying we didn't fight. We didn't have any fight. We lacked fight. And that's the sort of the prerequisite, or whatever I'm paraphrasing, but what you must have in games like this. Tom, that particular comment from Vicario talking about a lack of fight, given all I've just said about Frank being able to has a track record of taking on bigger and better teams at Brentford, at least, and doing really well, or even recent history with PSG or Man City. How concerning is that for you?
I didn't really see the lack of fight. I have to say, and not for me to disagree with Vicario, but I wonder if it's just sometimes you have a bad defeat and it feels like sort of something you say. Like I thought in the first 10, 15 minutes, let's not revise the game. Like there were some moments, I think Van der Ven, he sort of went through the back of, who it was, Trossard maybe. It was a really strong, big tackle. Udogie and Timber were having a sort of a tussle on the line. There was quite a lot of sort of niggle going on, and Romero was sort of flying into the face of the referee about decision, wasn't it, just before that Saka free kick. I didn't think Tottenham were lethargic. I didn't think they were soft, particularly. I just didn't think they offered anything. The sort of, the kind of image that kind of stays with me from that first half an hour is just sort of them winning a free kick on the halfway line a couple of times, and Vicario going up to it, and everyone loading the box, and then sort of Vicario launching one to the back post where Danso was there, and it didn't really come to anything. And that was sort of the maximum of Tottenham's kind of attacking threat. And I think we talked about this a bit in the preview pod, and I don't want to sort of contradict ourselves, because I was pretty clear in that pod. I think Spurs, I wanted them basically to do what they needed to do to kind of compete in this game and to make it a difficult match for Arsenal. Like, I was not advocating Spurs playing sort of gung-ho, free-flowing football. But equally, there is a balance, right? You have to, I think they could have put in a performance today where they could have been compact and they could have been solid. They could have even played 5 at the back, fine. But they didn't create anything. They didn't actually, when they had the ball, there didn't seem to be any plan there. It was almost like we would almost rather you have the ball, and we'll just kind of let you have it, and then we're going to try and frustrate you. And it seemed like the plan was almost to kind of just let the tension grow. Okay, let's get to 0-0 with 70 minutes, and then we'll try and nick one from a corner or something. And I just don't think that's enough. Like, you can't just allow Arsenal to have all of the ball all the time. Like, you have to have some escape route. You have to have some kind of spells of play. The long throw and the punting into the box, like, it's not enough to win the game, and it's not enough to as we've said, to bring the fans and the players with you. What I will say, and I went back over the results, because in some ways this kind of felt a bit like a sort of a Conte performance, like the way they kind of played this match. And I was remembering that game where they won at City 3-2 away from home, and they had 6 shots and City had 21. They had 25% possession and City had 75%. It is possible to win this kind of way, playing this kind of tactic, right? But who scored the goals that day? Kulusevski scored twice. Harry Kane scored once. Who gave the assist? Son gave 2 assists. Kulusevski gave the other one. If you want to play a counter-attacking game at the Etihad, or you want to play a counter-attacking game at the Emirates, you better have good counter-attacking players on the pitch. And if you've got Son, who in my opinion is the best counter-attacking forward the Premier League has ever seen, and you've got Kane, you can turn and spin and play a brilliant through ball to him, and you've got Kulusevski, you can hold the ball up and run it and run and run and run, then you've got a good lineup there to play a kind of counter-attacking game. In truth, Odegaard, Kudus, Richarlison, I've said this before, I don't think they're good enough to play that kind of game. I think Spurs, they didn't really have the escape routes. We can talk about Tottenham's back line, and when we talk about the quality of the team, I think the basis is there for a really good team here in terms of actually the defence and the defensive midfield. I think in the front third, I think they're really lacking in quality, and I think that really showed today. Like if you want to play a defensive performance, the kind of irony is you actually need really good attacking players, because you need players who can hold the ball up and bring you out of defence as well. It's not just about kind of everyone loading your own penalty area and hacking away all the time. And I didn't think Odegaard, to be honest, on the back of a really positive performance against United, I didn't think he really justified his place. And I didn't think Kudus or Richarlison really did enough, save for that brilliant strike. Maybe we should just touch on the one positive of the game, which was it was wonderful to watch that goal.
Well, we will.
It's so Richarlison, that, isn't it? So Richarlison. How many times do we see him miss from 2 yards out, and then he scores an overhead kick, and then he scores this goal? It's crazy.
Well, just hold that thought for a second, George. We can talk about Richarlison in a minute. Let's just go for an ad break, and afterwards we'll talk a bit about what Tom's alluding to there, about the selection choices, the lineup. Not so much the 5 at the back, but some of the creative players or different kind of counter-attacking players that, again, easy to say after the event, but maybe he should have gone with. And also, I think we have to talk a little bit about Eze, just because it's a sliding doors moment, isn't it, really, for Tottenham fans? What they could have won, I suppose. Anyway, we're back in a minute. So, George, let's start with Richarlison, because it felt like you were about to get in, go off on one about how frustrating, what a paradox of a player he is, capable of unbelievable things, and we saw it again today, but often so frustrating with the basics.
Yeah, I think brilliant goal, really, really fantastic goal, and it's kind of it was a perfect shot. I don't think there's any other, he had to hit it that well. If he hits it a little bit, if he underhits it a tiny bit, I think Raya probably tips it over. And if he overhits it a tiny bit more, then it probably goes over the bar. So a brilliant goal. But yeah, it's more kind of proof, isn't it, that he's just not the answer. And Spurs just missed Dominic Solanke so much. And I think Randall Colomani came on, and even that was a bit strange, really. He played left wing, and I've not checked, but I don't remember him touching the ball hardly at all. And I think I probably would have put him down the middle. just to kind of go back a little bit on Tom's point, I do agree with him actually. I didn't really think Spurs lacked fight today. I think if anything, they were just lacking maybe kind of dynamism and energy in that kind of central area. And look, I thought João Paulinho really put himself about and was one of Spurs' better players. And I thought Bentancur was okay, but you have to look at them two for Eze's 3 goals. Eze can be unmarked on the edge of the area or just inside the area once, and you say, okay, that can happen because he's a wonderfully gifted player and he gets into those pockets so naturally. But it can't happen 3 times, and if it does happen 3 times, then you have to point the finger at one of those 2 midfielders because surely that is their job to be picking him up. And yeah, I guess it just kind of further proof, isn't it, that Spurs missed out on a brilliant player that, we shouldn't kind of pretend he's been amazing for Arsenal. He's scored 2 goals in 17 appearances before today. He's now scored 3 in 1 game, typically against Spurs. But yeah, 3 really good strikes. And, I guess whilst Xavi was on the bench and he's not kind of 100% trusted by Thomas Frankie, I think it's fair to say you've got Eberechi Eze starting for Arsenal and just, becoming only the 4th player to score a hat-trick in the North London derby. It is a bit sliding doors. And yeah, the Arsenal are just very, very far ahead of Spurs. And today kind of further cements it. We already knew that, but I think that for me personally, they probably feel even more further away from Spurs than I kind of maybe first thought 24 hours ago.
What about you, Tom? I mean, before the game, we were doing our preview with Marcus. I was saying I thought Xavi should play. I just don't think you can. You need to be a bit control, and you have to have someone who can sort of hold on to the ball. And again, it's easy to say it. It's not like he made that much of an impact when he came on anyway, albeit the game was kind of gone. They were 2-0 down, then very quickly 3-0 down when he came on. But that selection, was that a mistake from Frank not starting him to try and give a bit more control? Kind of what you were saying about how you need attacking players, ironically, if you're going to play a counter-attack or defensive performance, you need players who can sort of take the game away, hold on to the ball and take it away from the opposition at the top. It's not like he's rapid, but he's got sort of ball manipulation skills that others don't, that maybe he should have gone with. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I was going to say maybe on the counter attack as well. He's got an eye for a pass, Xavi. We saw that ball, didn't he? Put through for I can't remember now. It was the Johnson goal, wasn't it? Where he can look up and play someone through, on the break, and that could have been valuable today. I don't know. I don't really feel strongly about Xavi. I don't look at his performance today and say, why didn't he start Xavi away at the Emirates? I can understand that. And on the Eze thing, I sort of think Spurs fans are over it. I know it's a great story for the media, and he played brilliantly today. But the guy supports Arsenal. He picked them because Arsenal went in for him, and I sort of think we don't need to over-egg the idea that Spurs fans are cut up about Eze playing well and scoring goals. I think Spurs fans are more pissed off today because they saw their team go to Arsenal and not really put a finger on them. And I think, to be honest, the bigger issue for Tottenham, and I said this at the time when they missed out on Eze, the worst thing they could do after missing out on that deal was to go and rush, spend the money on someone who didn't work. And the brave thing to do at that point would have been, if we don't really believe in our targets, if we don't think we've got someone ready to go, then we wait and we keep our powder dry. And in January or even next summer, we spend the 50, 60 million we had on someone we're convinced about. Here we are in the middle of November. And the bigger thing is that Eze's starting, as George said, and Xavi's not even starting. If Xavi is the replacement for Eze, then it hasn't worked yet. And that's not to say it won't work in the future, et cetera, et cetera. But we're 3 months into the season and it hasn't worked yet. So that money that they had for Gibbs White and for Eze, and they decided in the end to spend on Xavi, at the moment that hasn't worked, has it? They should have spent that somewhere else, or they should have kept it and spent it next year or even in January. So that's, in my opinion, that's the main disappointment there, is that the guy they went for after Eze hasn't delivered yet. Hopefully he can. And I think, your question was valid, Tom, in the press conference afterwards, saying, well, look, Xavi's been playing better in the last few weeks. Why didn't you pick him? And Frank actually answered, I don't know if it was in that answer, but he did say, didn't he, I think in one of the answers, he basically said Wilson's been playing really well. and it was Wilson or him. Which kind of suggests that he only wants to play one of them. Now, is that because of their physicality? Is it because of their defensive? Is it just because he doesn't want to play both of them at the same time? But I thought that was quite an interesting insight into the idea that maybe he sees it as an either or. Is that how you interpreted it?
No, I saw that relating to the fact that he was going to play back five today. So there was only obviously one fewer midfielder. He was always going to play Pauline and Bentancur, and therefore it was whoever played on the left. I think he could easily go back to Fulham at home, and I hope so, because that's a big game now. That he plays Xavi in the middle and Odebeck can go up out on the left. So I wouldn't read that much into that. I mean,
fair point. Fair enough.
I still look back at the transfer business, and I see your point, but I think if they really had talk about vibes earlier, if they'd missed out on signing anyone in that creative position, there would have been fans taken to the streets. So I don't know if that was possible, and also you could really make a case that maybe they should have had two. I mean, they were trying to get Gibbs White before Maddison got injured, and let's be honest, Maddison, is he even going to play this season? If he does, is he going to make any kind of impact? I still think there's definitely the jury's out over Xavi Simons as a signing, but you could definitely argue there should have been more than one. George, we're going to talk about PSG briefly at the end, but as a bit of a preview. But I think the debate so much around this game is about Thomas Frank, whether he likes it or not, and whether Spurs fans who were very much wanting change and saw him as the right appointment. But I think kind of back to my point at the start about the Chelsea performance and this performance sort of escalating the sort of frustration with him and his pragmatism is key. But again, in our preview podcast, we talked about Arteta and Frank's first Premier League game for Brentford, beating Arteta's Arsenal 2-0 through a long throw at the start of that season. And Arsenal then went on to lose their first three games, including getting absolutely battered by Man City 5-0. And the calls were obviously absolutely massive for him to get sacked by the Arsenal fans. And look, he hasn't won anything since, but we know that's obviously not the story. Look at where they are at now. And yes, he's been backed as well, but they look right in the box seat. They look like they're absolutely purring, and that sort of patience has really paid off. We're only 4 months into Thomas Frank's reign. And I'm sure, based on knowing you and also what you said before, you're going to advocate for at least a season anyway for any manager. But are you seeing things so far that suggest that sort of long term, and I mean more than just a season, patience with Thomas Frank could lead to him taking Tottenham into a position where they can genuinely compete with Arsenal?
No, not at the minute. And I want Thomas Frank to work, and the Arteta comparison is understandable. But Arteta was showing, he had 2 8th place finishes. The first one was kind of half a season, and the second one was his first full season. But even in that second season, if I remember rightly, he had a period, I think it was after about 12 months in the job, where the pressure was building. And it's a little bit what I spoke about recently. And he went to Emil Smith-Rowe, he went to Saka. And I think Emil Smith-Rowe scored in a 3-1 win against Chelsea, it was. And that was kind of the moment where it went. And then in fairness to Arsenal, and it's a really painful moment looking back, when Tottenham beat Arsenal to 4th place in 2022, it would have been. I personally thought that was a sliding doors moment for Tottenham, in that Tottenham would get Champions League and kick on from there and move past Arsenal under Conte at that point. And Arsenal under Arteta would kind of fall away. And what Arsenal did that summer is they backed Mikel Arteta. I'd fairly certainly signed a new deal sort of during the next kind of 6 months. And they went from strength to strength. And obviously Conte got sacked kind of 8 months later. But always throughout those early periods for Arteta, you could see what he wanted his team to play like. Even when they'd lose games, they went to, as you say, they went to Man City and lost 5-0. But they were trying to play out from the back at that point. They were a different team to what they are now. Now they're kind of so much more defensively solid, and you see sprinkles of the great football as we saw today. But it's kind of largely behind the foundations of a really solid team. But when you look at Frank's team, we're not seeing enough. And I think the last 4 games kind of sums up where he's at right now. You obviously have a terrible performance against Chelsea. And look, any Tottenham any Tottenham manager can lose to Chelsea. They all have. But there's a way that you lose. It's not 0.05 xg. They beat Copenhagen, very good performance. We can't grumble at that. The Man United, even in the Man United game, you've got fans booing his substitution. And then now you come to today and you lose 4-1 to Arsenal. So there's 4 games there in November where we kind of think we're going to be seeing progress. And 3 of those games, there's real kind of major issues, isn't there? And look, this is a big week for him. He's not going to get sacked if he loses 5-0 to PSG and loses 1-0 at home to Fulham, but he just needs to start showing more. And he just needs to get this team playing more in the Tottenham way. The name of our podcast is the Tottenham Way. I saw Mickey Hazard put a great tweet out, Tottenham legend from the 80s, won the UEFA Cup. And he said, I think it was tactics don't matter, but we have the Tottenham Way, and you have to play the Tottenham Way. And, rightly or wrongly, Tottenham play in a certain manner. They have flair players, they attack, they don't care so much for defence. And yeah, maybe Spurs would have more trophies if they had focused on defence over the last 30, 40 years, but it's just in Tottenham's DNA to play like that. It's not actually in Arsenal's. Arsene Wenger changed that. Arsenal were always 1-0 to the Arsenal under George Graham and further back. So what Arteta's doing is fine, really, from a defensive point of view. He doesn't have to be super attacking. The Tottenham managers and Tottenham's best teams have always attacked brilliantly. And at the minute, Thomas Frank's team is not attacking brilliantly, and that's really what he needs to work on. And it can't be set pieces. We need to see more patterns. And I said it a couple of pods back, he has to kind of stick with the connections that are slowly being built. And Xavi and Odegaard, they haven't set the world alight, but there is a connection there, and they need to start at home to Fulham. And Udogie should be left back. Udogie had a really poor performance, I felt, today. And he's been good lately, but I just think he generally balances the team. And in fairness to him, he was in a different position today, left wing back. But Thomas Frank's got to stick with something. I understand he has to tweak stuff for certain games, and he's handled that very well. But especially for these home games coming up, Fulham at home, Brentford the following home game, he's got to be winning those games. If he's not winning those games, there is going to be serious questions about him. And the other thing around this office, we don't know what the Lewis family are like. We don't. We know what Daniel Levy was like, and he got rid of Nuno early. Generally, everyone else has got a year to a year and a half. But we don't know what the Lewis family are like. If the Lewis family want Champions League this season, and Tottenham are 13th, 14th come Christmas time, maybe they do make a change. I don't know where they'd go, but we actually don't know that, because this is their kind of first real go as the kind of major powerhouse of the club, and it not being Daniel Levy's Tottenham.
It's an interesting point, that, because I'm not sure about that, because I can't imagine, I don't know this, but that them getting rid of Daniel Levy wasn't sort of planned ahead of time. I don't think it was suddenly a decision that was made early September. It's got to have been something that they obviously kept to themselves, because by all accounts, Levy had no idea it was coming. By all accounts, Vinay Venkatesham had no idea it was coming, or if he does, he plays an amazing poker face. But it feels like that would have been something they were thinking of months before, i.e. when they hired Frank in the first place, or Daniel Levy did. So is it really, suddenly it's a completely different beast that Thomas Frank is now, reporting to than he was when he was first hired by Levy? Well, how do you see that, Tom? That's quite an interesting point. Do you really think this is a completely
just to jump in a bit?
Sorry, George.
Just to jump in with a bit of context, I'm sure it's not like this, but it could be like Nuno was Paratici's man and not Levy's man, and Frank could be Vinay's man, not the Lewis family's man. That's kind of how I can sort of, if things go horribly wrong over the next month and all of a sudden there is a scenario where he's under real pressure, I imagine the Lewis family would dress it up that Vinay made this decision and he's got it wrong, and people make decisions wrong, but this was never their man, and that's how it would be kind of probably kind of pushed out in the media. But yeah, he could be their man, but I just wonder if that's the way it could work.
I can see that point.
I think Vinay is key, isn't he? I mean, I was just going to say, Tom, I think Vinay is key, because he was at the centre of that decision with Levy, with Langya. I think I think the Lewis's will rubber stamp a decision, but we don't know. George is right, but I think Vinay is the key to it. And I guess, you wonder whether Vinay's experience at Arsenal will make him feel, slightly more patient than perhaps, another chief executive, perhaps. I think there is a lot of good feeling for Frank within the club. I have to say that. I think you hear people talk about him. They talk about him really well. That he's a very positive influence. That he's very interested in everything that's going on at the club. They're really building for the long term around him. There isn't this sense, I don't think, inside the club of a guy who's just sort of been dropped in as a head coach, and then within a month or two they could just get rid of him and bring someone else in. Now, of course, football results are results, and sometimes they take on a narrative of their own. I'm not saying it's impossible that Frank, doesn't leave before the end of the season. But I do think that Spurs, when they started this project with Frank and with all the kind of new execs and the new medical staff and the sports science, Frank was very much part of the selection process with Dan Lewandon as the new performance director. Let's not underestimate how much I think Frank is kind of part of this big kind of restart for Spurs, in the last kind of 6 months. I think ripping that out, and putting a new guy in, let's say mid-season, I think would be a big step. I don't think it's impossible. If results and performances continue, and like they did today, then anything is up in the air, of course. But I think Frank is a real sort of keystone in this project, and I think they won't take that decision lightly.
I see what you're saying, and also just to sort of touch on the idea of him being sacked and being replaced, because a lot of fans are talking about it and almost calling for it, some of them. I just don't even know where they would even start to look for a replacement, because say you're Andoni Iraola, who I presume some people are going, we should get him instead. First of all, they couldn't get him mid-season last year when they were at times thinking of sacking Ange. But is he really going to look at a club that have just sacked a manager who finally won them something, replaced him with someone else? Maybe we can understand the logic behind it, or you can understand the logic behind it, but then sack him after 5 months? There are lots of reasons why I think that's, unless it gets to untenable levels, that it's not going to happen. But I just don't even know where they would start when it comes to trying to hire someone in the if they're in that event. But Tom, I wanted to ask you actually, because you did a good piece the other day about Frank and other managers of a similar ilk, of a similar standing in the Premier League, trying to make that step up to an elite club, which Tottenham, pride themselves on being, and it certainly is in terms of scrutiny and expectation, if not hitting the same heights as they were consistently under Poch in terms of being in the top four. Can you sort of explain a bit about that and what you sort of learned from doing that piece over all the challenge that is facing Frank before we even had this result and performance at the Emirates?
Yeah, I did a piece, it was for the Sunday Times, and just sort of looking at historically how managers have done when they've kind of been asked to kind of step up from, let's call them the middle classes in the Premier League or lower down and take one of the kind of big six jobs, if you like. And I guess we always think, don't we? We just talked about it there, who would be next? And you sort of think, well, Iraola's doing a good job at Bournemouth, or Glasner's doing a good job at Palace, or I don't know, Eddie Howe at Newcastle. And you sort of always look down the Premier League and think who's the next kind of, big talent who could maybe do a big job. But actually, you look at it historically, and the likes of Potter, Moyes, Hodgson, Nuno, there aren't many success stories in that group. There aren't. And I guess one of the big things that Frank can lean on is that the one or two successes really that you would say, Pochettino and Redknapp, I think, and possibly Rodgers at Liverpool. Me and Tom were discussing that in the media lounge earlier, whether that's a success or not. But I think Pochettino for sure, and I think even Spurs fans who didn't like Redknapp would say that he was in the end a decent appointment. They were both at Spurs, right? And I think Spurs is probably the softest landing ground because, they are, let's be honest, the closest of the big six to the mid-table, probably in terms of the budget, the salary, the pressure, expectations, that kind of thing. So I think it's not impossible for a Frank to do a good job at Spurs. But I was trying to talk to as many people who had been kind of close to some of those previous managers and about those kind of challenges. And they were basically saying that, boardrooms and directors of the big clubs, they look down the league, but there's not enough appreciation for the fact that actually it's a completely different job. In many ways, it's a completely different job. You're essentially becoming a manager rather than a coach, because ultimately the big clubs, you're having to manage really good players who don't necessarily want to be coached to the level that sometimes when you're going lower down, even, lower down the Premier League, you're trying to make players technically better. If you're coaching players who are in the Champions League and they're really good players already. They don't want to have, there's that famous story of Benitez telling Luka Modric how to pass the ball with the outside of his foot, and Benitez still gets asked about that in Spain to this day, so it's that kind of light touch, management that obviously Ancelotti provides. And listen, there are no like clear brushstrokes here. There are counterexamples across the board, of course. But I think there is a challenge that sometimes we underestimate, and it was interesting just on Frank specifically. I remember asking someone a sort of a coach who worked with a really big Premier League manager who won a lot of titles. And we were talking about that, the Spence and Van de Ven thing, and saying how, whether the players, how they apologise. And he said, yeah, but you know what? Frank made a mistake there, because big manager in a big team, in a big stadium, the cameras on, with a television match, you don't tell your players to go over and thank the fans in front of everyone when they're fuming after a defeat. You're leaving yourself vulnerable there to them saying, no, I'm not doing that, and making you look stupid. So don't even ask them the question. Get in the changing rooms, and if you want to tell them that message, tell them it later. But that was just that sort of thing. And he said, maybe at Brentford, people might notice it, but it wouldn't cause a storm. There's the kind of thing at Tottenham, like a little video clip like that becomes a week's worth of news, right? And it's just these little things, I think, that when you're stepping up into a bigger club, it is a slightly different job, And there was someone who was sort of saying it's a bit like in a business. You're a founder of a startup where you're managing 5 or 6 employees. If that startup gets bought out, and suddenly you're a director of a major tech firm or something, that's a completely different job. And it's not a dissimilar thing in management. It's not to say that Frank can't do well. Clearly, Pochettino made that step and did brilliantly, as I say. And he has some of those skills, I think. And Frank has made a really positive start around the club in lots of ways. But I think it does just speak to that shift that we're talking about. It is quite a significant jump to make.
Yeah, it just feels a bit harsh, sort of. Kind of, that was Frank's good nature, really, that we're sort of saying wasn't the right thing for him to do in that position. He should have done it differently. And funny enough, I spoke to Darren Anderton for a piece this week, and he, of his own volition, came up with, mentioned the Spence and Van de Ven situation, and described it as them mugging off the manager. He didn't like it at all. He's not the first person to talk about it, including Thomas Tuchel, as we mentioned the other day. So I don't know. I thought Frank dealt with that situation very, very well, but it seems like a lot of people within football, and that's the key, as opposed to just us or fans, saw that incident like you've just described, and as I've said with obviously Tuchel and Anderton, taking quite sort of strong opinions on that event, whether it be being damning of Frank in your particular case or Tuchel and Anderton when it comes to the players. Did you want to say something else there, Tom?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm just remembering as well how I was speaking to someone who knew Pochettino really well, and he was kind of saying, and I went back reading Pochettino's book, of course, which was great on so many of these things, and how Poch, at this point in that first season in November, he was also under pressure like this, and it was that Aston Villa match, wasn't it, where him and Jesus and they were all kind of fearing the sack when they were maybe going to lose that game, and he said, that after that match we realised, now we've got to go our own way. Like, we've got to stop listening to all the noise. And I think that is part of being at a big club. There are lots of cooks in the kitchen. You've got sporting directors, you've got performance directors, you've got chief executives, and it's not the same, I think, lower down, where you have a much smaller, close-knit team. At a club like Spurs, there are a lot of voices. There's a lot of noise. And I think that thing that Pochettino realised, that we sort of have to go our own way. And if it doesn't work, then fine, we'd be damned about it. But ultimately, let's do it the way we want to do it. And I think he wrote a lovely thing in his book. He basically said, right, lock the doors, because it was like, this is how we're going to do it from now on. And you've got to be brave. I think there is that slight sense when you're a sort of a manager coming up that, this is the biggest job of your career. So in a way, you're being nice to everyone. But actually, I think this is relevant to Frank. He's got to be brave now. He's got to be decisive about it. He's got to think, which are the players I can really rely on? Like, what are the views I can take that I can trust? Enough of the kind of namby-pamby stuff. Like, actually, let's hear some leadership here, because it's kind of what the team needs now. I think the nice guy stuff is nice to a point. But actually, when you get into the trenches, like Spurs are in now, I think Frank has to double down on something, and it doesn't really matter what it is. It was what Andrew was quite good at, to be honest. Like, he was good at doubling down on stuff just because it gives the players belief. It gives them conviction. And I think to some extent, Frank has to be brave now and be decisive. He can't down himself.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about the players maybe in the Champions League who already know their game, don't want to be coached, use the Rafa Benitez example. I don't know if that's quite relevant to Tottenham. I feel like a lot of their squad are sort of young and there to be moulded. They need to be. I mean, there are a few that maybe...
They need a lot of coaching. Yeah,
they do,
I agree.
well, to a certain extent. I mean, I was going to throw on to George that point there. I mean, do you agree with me? Like it's kind of totally understand what Tom's saying, and it's massively relevant to a Rafa Benitez trying to coach a Gareth Bale and a Cristiano Ronaldo and Modric, etc. at Real Madrid. But this Tottenham team, it's a weird one. Like, yes, there's part of the established Big Six, but in reality, they're nowhere near it at the moment, at least on the pitch. Obviously, the stadium's fantastic, and it feels like it's there for someone who has got a track record of being a master developer of talent. This is being positive towards Thomas Frank, which I know before we got on this podcast, you were like, let's find some positivity. But that's part of the reason to believe, isn't it? The reason to keep the faith.
It is, if he plays the young players. Look at the bench today: Lucas Bergvall, Archie Gray, Tell that scored a brilliant goal against Man United. Xavi Simons is young. It was a team of men today. Let's be honest. Paulinho, Bentancur, Romero, Van de Ven, Vicario, Richarlison, Kudos. I know he's not like really old, but he's got a lot of experience. I do get your point, Tom. There is young players in this squad that he can develop, and I saw him talking to Oliver after about 20 minutes, sort of giving him further instructions. But I did look at that team today and feel like that's a team of men that should be able to go toe to toe with Arsenal. And I kind of, sort of going over old ground, but I just don't think that they would have enjoyed the way that game went. And I guess looking ahead to PSG, he can't play five at the back at PSG, right? Because the players will have no confidence in that. They've just gone to Arsenal and lost 4-1. You can't. I know it worked in August in the Super Cup, but I just feel like he can't go to PSG now and play that formation. Or do you guys think he can? You can just write this game off?
It's a really good point.
Difficult, yeah.
But you've got one. Yeah, you've got on the one hand, you've got evidence of it working very well, albeit obviously a heartbreaking defeat on penalties. But let's be honest, I mean, Spurs fans were fearing the worst ahead of that game, and it was a really surprisingly good performance. But then you've had what's happened at Arsenal. I don't know. I feel like they need to wash their hands of this particular game quite quickly and just start again to a certain extent. What do you think, Tom? I mean, I was going to throw it forward to PSG. Where do they go from here? Do you think Xavi needs to come into the team and have a bit of control?
Yeah, that's an option for sure. I mean, I thought Xavi was quite bright today when he came on. I thought I don't know if it was a performance to sort of earn a start, but I think he could start definitely. I mean, we were talking, weren't we, Tom, before kickoff in the media centre at Arsenal, and kind of looking ahead to this week. And I think I sort of said that we were kind of talking about what would be a good week. So I think that sort of the bar was, avoid a thrashing, beat Fulham, and maybe a pleasant surprise. And I said I don't think the surprise necessarily needs to be getting a draw against Arsenal or PSG. I just think it needs to be a good performance in one of those games, and they've already, unfortunately, crossed one of the boxes, which they've already been thrashed. So I think, now the other two.
He was so optimistic at that moment. How naive and sort of.
So was I. I was talking about long throws, and Kevin Danso's long throw is going to cause the winner for Tottenham. God, that was great 12 hours ago.
But the other two boxes left to tick, I guess, are beating Fulham at home. And I think we look at this week now, and to be honest, the PSG game, Spurs are in a decent position in the Champions League. I don't think it's the most important game of the week, though, which is funny to say. They're playing against the European champions. The most important game of the week now is beating Fulham at home. They can lose away at PSG, and if they don't disgrace themselves, I don't think it really tweaks the dial. In a way, it's a bit of a free hit still. I think there's a bit more weight on it now because of that result against Arsenal. I think they don't want to go there and get mashed. But I think as long as it's a respectable result, I think the main thing is the game of the weekend now. I really think that is true. And I just go back, and before we wrap up, you go back to sort of what Frank has always said, when you ask him about his kind of commitment to attacking football and positivity, he loves that phrase, doesn't he? That to not take a risk is also a risk, and you think today, how many risks did they take? Did they take any risks really, like with the setup, with the personnel, with the way they played? I thought, there wasn't any risk there, and that was the risk. And the risk was that it backfired massively, because now Frank is under, in my opinion, a decent amount of pressure going into this week. So, I think that it's two big games, but I think in a way the Fulham one is the one they'll really have their eye on.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. That feels like the really big one, mainly because of where they're at in the Champions League. They've had a good start points wise, and it's a free hit at PSG. George, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on from today's performance in particular, or looking ahead to PSG?
I think with PSG, I think what Tom's saying is kind of right. I think he needs to stick with something, and I'd probably be tempted to kind of rip up the three at the back and go back to what was actually kind of slowly looking okay. The 4-2-3-1. Xavi as a 10, Odegaard on the left, Kudus or Johnson on the right, and I think it probably is another game for Bentancur and Paulinho, but actually put in one of the younger guys, give them an opportunity against a really, really good PSG team. But, let's not forget they have got injuries. Ousmane Dembele sounds sort of touch and go. He wasn't involved in their game on Saturday against Le Havre. Doué's missing. They just lost to Bayern Munich a couple of weeks ago, PSG, so they're not exactly in the best of moments. And admittedly, Bayern Munich are brilliant. But, I think Hakim is injured as well, isn't he? So they've got some problems. Spurs don't need to go there with five at the back and try and get 0-0, get out of there alive. Let's see some sort of attacking intent, and then that will hopefully, Colin Wine is going to be determined to do well there against his old club, and hopefully he starts. I'd like to see sort of. I think that the Fulham game is really important. Tom is right; that's the biggest game of the week. The Spurs don't want to go into that having lost 3-0 at PSG or 2-0 and had two shots on target and an XG of 0.1 again. They need to go there and show some mettle, show some character. Because look, PSG are obviously the Champions League winners, a brilliant side, but they can also be a little bit vulnerable at the back at times. Luis Enrique plays a wonderful style of, wonderful brand of football, but you can get out of them. So go there and take it to them. You lose 3-1, lose 4-2, at least you've had a go. I think Spurs fans would appreciate that.
Yeah, it definitely feels like something we've been saying quite consistently ahead of recent games, that the performance and putting on an ambitious performance and taking some risk is almost what matters more than getting a result that not many people are expecting. And particularly after today's dire performance, let's be honest, one that was really hard to take any inspiration from. It is very much needed. Anyway, chaps, really appreciate your company as always, and I'm sure we'll do a reaction one after the PSG game. Hopefully it goes a bit better than today's at the Emirates. But for everyone listening and watching, thanks very much.